Hey everyone. When I originally set out to do this video, I had actually read this book yesterday. At this point, it's now been about almost half a year, but I'm still interested to talk about this book, which I collected my thoughts on right after reading it, so hope you enjoy. So I read this book when I was returning from a nice vacation, and on the plane on the way back, I read the entirety of The Employees by Olga Ravn. I found it a fast read. It's not very long, and it probably took me only about 3 hours, despite my normally not being that quick of a reader. However, it's definitely the kind of book that you could return to and read more of after a first pass through, and that some might read much more slowly if they're in the mood to take their time and really digest each part of it. In fact, because of the way it's written, as a series of individual accounts by employees on a spaceship, you could probably even go back and read it out of order. I knew a very small amount about the story before I started reading. This book has received a fair amount of attention and accolades, including a short listing for the 2021 International Booker Prize. The book was originally published in Danish, as well as being shortlisted for the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Imaginative Fiction in 2022. It comprises a series of interviews, each with a different employee of some corporation operating some interstellar spaceship. Despite knowing this, the style was somewhat different than I expected. There is a sort of central story to the book, but it's never really approached head on. Instead, you sort of just piece together some of this central scenario by all sorts of little allusions. It actually feels a bit like playing a sci-fi exploratory video game like Myst, or something where you're kind of just dropped in an alien world and you have to go around collecting notes and making observations to gather some semblance of a story that still is not going to be fully pieced together by the end. I did actually like this element, and I thought it was one of the strongest stylistic choices by the author. Good. Also, I'd argued the central story is rather loosely told still, and only a small part of the overall book. Learning about the crew of this ship and their interactions with one another, as well as with a set of mysterious objects, and there's really nothing more that these things can be called than the objects that were obtained from a foreign planet, that is the heart of the story here. I initially found it somewhat hard to follow for a few reasons. The book is told in a fairly awkward style without any real justification for this format, although pseudo-explanation is given at the end as to why the book is just presented as a series of pretty disjointed interviews. I think it actually would have been better, though, just implicitly delivered as a deliberate stylistic choice without this attempted scientific explanation for why it had to happen this way. Additionally, the testimonials of the employees are often extremely cryptic, and many of them read less like an exit interview than some impressionistic dreamscape stream of consciousness. Furthermore, presumably to leave some kind of suspense or motivation to finish the book, most of the meatiest explanations of what's going on occur towards the end of the list, which also feels a little bit contrived. Again, this isn't necessarily such a bad thing, but it makes those first 10 or 20 testimonials feel as if they were just deliberately placed there so that they would feel disorienting and almost nonsensical upon first encountering them. All in all, these stylistic decisions give a little more of an artsy or less conventional feel to this book, but in many cases they feel forced in for expressly this purpose and didn't really enhance my reading experience. Furthermore, as unconventional or artistic as it feels at the beginning, the tail end of this book ultimately felt less so to me, with still subtle but definitely more concrete takeaway points and somewhat of a tidier resolution to the story than I had expected. None of the sci-fi territory covered by this book is anything particularly new, nor does it really try to be. Humans and humanoids, cybernetic augmentations, employees of some interstellar space corporation. If you're well read in science fiction, I'm sure you've seen it many times already. Nevertheless, I still did like the book. I enjoyed it more for the individual accounts and explorations than for the overall story. What are these objects that exert this strange psychological effect on the passengers? Do they actually possess some sort of soul or spiritual essence, or is this simply some projection of the crew members' own psychology onto these objects? How are the individual passengers uniquely affected by the objects and by one another? Which passenger accounts are obviously written by humans, which ones are obviously by humanoids, and which ones are impossible to tell just from reading their accounts? There are unmistakable, but still usually rather subtle, metaphysical and existential undertones to this book. Is it better to die at the end of your life once and for all, or to exist as a program that can be reinstantiated in some new body? But also, do we even buy that it's the same person being reinstantiated in that new body? What makes the person continuous? And here's an example of where I think that question is better raised than it was in Kazuo Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, if you saw my review of that one a while back. Though I did still ultimately like that book as well, so I'm not trying to disrecommend that one. The Employees doesn't belabor these questions, but it does imply them, giving this book a richness that extends beyond its seemingly short length. Additionally, though I had some fears that a book about employees of a mega space corporation might devolve into a thinly veiled and possibly not particularly thoughtful anti-capitalist allegory, I actually found the description of the employees' role within the overarching corporation to be well portrayed and thought-provoking, albeit with things going a little bit overboard at the end, in which the corporation does come out fairly obviously as the bad guy. I think the book would have been stronger without that final touch, leaving it more to the reader's final interpretation. From the employee testimonials, it's already abundantly clear that the corporation is a sort of totalitarian system that intends for itself to be the employee's entire world, and for many of them, to serve it is the highest purpose they can imagine. And we can think about to what extent we view our own jobs as our sole purpose, or to what extent our society encourages us to aspire to productivity as an end in itself. But for most of the book, at least, rather than seeing this portrayal as an unequivocal denouncement of corporations, I also thought of it in the more abstract sense. I thought about the corporation in relation to other overarching structures humans create in our lives. Religion, biology, ethical systems. Take your pick for how you choose to understand the world. I may not consciously live my life with some corporation as my ultimate goal that I work towards, but if I live my life with any sort of overarching purpose or ideals, then I can ask, how is this different or similar to what we see in the book here? Who's to say that that's not just the program as it's described in this book? Is it so much different than if I were the property of some company and set on Earth to achieve this function? And I'm not arguing here that there's no difference, by the way. I'm just highlighting this as food for thought that I think the author does well in this book also to highlight. Finally, one of the most powerful themes covered, in my opinion, was simply the tendency of both humans and humanoids to critically view their own humanity, like the gain and loss of things like social connection, emotional sensitivity, and more other abstract qualities like appreciation of nature or of beauty, and to explore what is it like to be a human with and without these different attributes or behaviors, and which ones do you have to be a human. This is more of a vague concept to me, but one that the book definitely suggests. So for my review, I'll just leave it at that, and I hope that that gives you something to think about as well. So before I wrap up this short-ish discussion, I'll also mention there are quite a few other interesting discussions on YouTube about this book. One that I particularly enjoyed, as I think it first alerted me to this book's existence, is Willow's review on the channel formerly Books and Bow. I think it may just be Willow Talks Books now. I'll link that one in the description, as I highly recommend it. I watched it again after reading the book, and I still think that it is spot on. And probably my review here wouldn't have existed without that one spurring me on to reading it. So all in all, despite a few gripes about this book, I enjoyed it, and I think it's something many of you would find value in reading. So let me know if you've read it and what you thought, and until next time, happy reading.